I'm Akanksha Rastogi, Senior Curator, Programming and Exhibitions at the Grenada Museum of Art. It is a pleasure to have you all joining us today for the third lecture of the series Researchers Practice, which we started with a very simple question and intention of bringing focus to the figure of the researcher, who's usually hidden or gets tucked away in so many other more visible roles within the infrastructures of the arts. And so simply to ask what research is now and what is the research role of research in contemporary arts and culture. In this Researchers Practice lecture series, we invite researchers, art historians, curators, exhibition studies enthusiasts, and artists to share and discuss their individual trajectories, the inventive forms, formats, and manifestations of their research. The idea is to collectively and discursively address the complexities of research forms, be it as research exhibitions, creative research, curatorial, artistic, or post-institutional research, or be it research exhibitions or artworks themselves as knowledge systems. And through the series at KNMA, we hope to survey these various forms and formats and historiographies and try and look at the infrastructure of research and research networks that enable, form, push, a coming together of certain groups, questions, and methodologies. So we started the series in April this year with Hamad Nasser's delivering the inaugural lecture, Conditions of Entry, Curatorial Agency and Intervention in the Histories of Art, leading a workshop also on the question of ethics and curatorial practice. You can access his lecture on our YouTube channel. And then the second lecture by Alexander Keefe, titled as I'm Not Sorry, I'm Late, and quite true to its spirit, was postponed. And so we'll announce the rescheduled date soon. But continuing our engagement and the series with these exceptional, remarkable curators and writers and scholars, I'm very, very thrilled to invite and have the pleasure of hosting Nida Ghouse today. Nida is an exceptional writer, researcher, and curator. I've been a keen follower and admirer of her work. She started her research towards what she calls as an archaeology of sound in 2012. That traces an early moment in the history of sound reproduction, and since has been working through this question of materiality and implications of sound recordings. She's made several curatorial collaborations with documentary films, sound-based practices in contemporary art, and most important and recent one is her collaboration with self-taught acoustic archaeologist Uma Shankar Mantravadi, whom a lot of us might be familiar with, who has been building experimental ambisonic systems to map and measure acoustic properties of ancient and medieval sites across India. Nida is visiting lecturer at the interdisciplinary doctoral program in the humanities at Princeton University for spring 2022, and also the co-artistic director of the Singapore Biennale 2022, which actually got announced last week. So many, many congratulations, Nida. We're very thrilled about that. With Victoria Brooks, she received this year the Andy Warhol Foundation Curatorial Fellowship for the exhibition Shifting Center, which is forthcoming next year at IMPAC. And at House of World Cultures, she recently curated a slightly curving place in the framework of Archaeology of Sound, her long-term project with Uma Shankar, and the project is now traveling to Al Circle Arts Foundation in Dubai through the year next year, and encompasses a lot of programs, particularly with Brooke Holmes, a discursive program, Coming to Know, a supplementary country called Cinema, a film program with Surabhi Sharma, a publication series with Archive Books, and previously she's co-curated Parapolitics, Cultural Freedom, and the Cold War in 2017, and also co-edited the accompanying publication with Sternberg Press. So today in this lecture, which she is very provocatively titled as Curator as Cat's Whisker. Nida will take us through some of the threads in her research practice, and particularly this proposition of exhibition as listening, an exhibition of listening. And so we hope to go deeper into her curatorial research and the question that she puts forward through that for us to contemplate today on what it means for curatorial practice to be true to material, and what material and materiality may also mean in terms of curating and exhibition making and thinking. So I would hand over the charge to Nida now to take it from here, and you can please put your questions to Nida after her presentation. And you can type in if you're in the Q&A box if you're watching us on Zoom, or if you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube live. Please feel free to add in your questions in the comment section. We'll make sure your questions reach and your remarks reach after the end of the session. So over to you, and I'll stop the screen share.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to begin by thanking you, Akanksha, for inviting me to think through my work in the context of this series. That is for attending to my practice and for bringing it into company, not only with other practices that you are considering, but also with the propositions you are making in your own work, through your long and deep engagement with lesser known exhibition histories in India, and the ways in which those histories might inform what curating in the contemporary can still become. Thank you for doing this with such grace and care, not only over the past weeks and months that we have been in discussion towards this event, but also over the years. Despite the intermittent nature of our encounters, which really have been too few and far between, our conversations have invariably seemed to me to be bursting at the seams of the time we had. And I think, if I may say so myself, always left both of us wanting to have more of them. This is then also my way of acknowledging that my imperative today or tonight is very much to continue this discussion we've been having about exhibition making, collaborative practices, and about a biography of research, a term I've kept from something Kojo Eshin once said to me in response to a research and writing project, Lotus Notes. By occasioning a way for us to do this publicly, Akanksha has not only enabled us to sustain this conversation, but added a dimension of responsibility to it that I can only hope to fulfill. I say this because, as I've been mentioning to her, I'm in a place in my practice where I'm acutely aware, as many of us often are, of a fundamental non-identification or incommensurability between what one does, one's crafts, one's practice of making and doing, one's techne, and talking or writing about it. Even as I am, insofar as the larger scheme of things, committed, like she is, to move dialectically between theory and practice, between thinking and doing, but also to tarry what it might mean to make that dialectical move my subject. Finally, while this talk is online and therefore not determined by geography, it is nevertheless not so often that I find myself sharing my practice in a context back home. And I wanted to also acknowledge that I'm happy and humbled to be doing that. Once again, thank you for inviting me. Thank you also to the team at KNMA, Priya, Hari, Madhurima, and Shikha for all the back-end work and for helping us through yesterday's and today's tech check. One of the vitrines in the exhibition, A Slightly Curving Place, that took place at Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin in 2020, comprised an odd assortment of objects. A tiny Galena crystal, a variable tuning capacitor, a copper wire, a Horlicks bottle, a wooden board, an aerial wire, and a pair of Air Force headphones. All components that Uma Shankar Mantravadi, the self-taught acoustic archaeologist to whom this exhibition responded, used to build a Galena Crystal radio as a young boy in Madras in the 1950s. The corresponding entry in the exhibition handbook reads, "If memory serves, Uma Shankar built his first radio at the age of 7, or maybe 11. What is certain is that it was a Galena Crystal radio, invented at the turn of the 20th century and commercially obsolete by the 1920s. The non-electric crystal set remained in use through World War II and re-emerged as a craze among hobbyists and children in the 1950s. You can actually change the slide, which is around when Uma Shankar came to it. As the antenna picked up radio waves from the ether, he used the cat's whisker, a fine metal wire shaped like an S, to find a point of contact on the surface of the crystal from which a current could flow. That is to say, he tuned into the material by hand in order to listen. Broadcast from various distances, the sound was only ever as loud as its signal and relied on the labor of listening to be heard. Audible to him alone, the faint waves from All India Radio were all it took for a young boy to get hooked to an old technology. Soon he could distinguish stations not through content, but audio properties. When Radio Moscow tried to sound like the BBC, he could make that out too. From his family's noisy living room, Uma Shankar had began his practice of tuning into the spaces of nearly imperceptible faraway places. In an essay titled How I Became an Acoustic Archaeologist, forthcoming in a publication that is to accompany, follow the exhibition, Slightly Cooking Place, Uma Shankar writes, in fact, it's how he begins his essay, and I quote, "When I was 6 or 7, I was given a copy of The Water Babies. I spent a lot of time trying to copy the wonderful fish drawings in the book. It was an unusual experience. The house in Madras I grew up in during the 1950s was full of books, but they were not children's books. A little later, I got to exchange that book for one that was far more useful. It was called 100 Things a Boy Can Make. I learned about box kites and used to make a new one every few weeks to take to the beach. There was a model aircraft that looked too difficult to build, but I think he built it, if you've seen the photograph. And there was a radio, ! It seemed impossible. It became impossible when an uncle, the only science graduate in the house, ruled, radios are made in factories. Radios cannot be made by small boys. No support, no encouragement, no funds. That was all the incentive I needed. I asked in every radio repair shop, there used to be a dozen in Milapur where I lived, and finally found a place to buy a Galena Crystal. It seemed to be the most difficult part to source. Once I had it, I made a copper coil, 80 turns on a Horlicks bottle, got a tuning capacitor from Moore's Market, found a piece of wood to mount everything on, strung a long wire from a window upstairs to a window next door, and attached another wire to the kitchen tap as an earth connection. Then I needed 5 rupees to buy a pair of Air Force headphones. That took a while and cajoling. I was not very good at it, but finally I had one for a single year, and I could hear All India Radio. It was very faint. No one else could hear it, but I could hear it, and I was hooked." End quote. The description of my talk goes like this. A cat's whisker is a fine metal wire shaped in a curve. In a non-electric radio set, as the antenna picks up signal from the ether, this wire is dragged around the surface of the crystal until it detects a point through which the current can flow. At the turn of the 20th century, when the Galena Crystal radio came into popular use, the physical principles by which the semiconductor worked were not properly understood, even assumed by some to be bordering on the mystical. Thinking through this operation as one informed by a series of internal connections, I will try to ask what it means for curatorial practice to be true to material. So this is a talk about methodology, or perhaps I should say this is a talk that wants to be about methodology. In asking what it means for a practice to be true to material, I want to recognize from the outset that I consider the material I draw on and work with to be polyphonic. Obvious as that may be, to insist on the polyphony of my material or of any material, and no matter how the term material might be understood or defined, such as research material, but also, for example, in the exhibition, voice as material, voice also as object, voice also as surface, and this changes things, but perhaps we'll get back to that in the discussion. So no matter how we define material, this idea of material as polyphonic is perhaps one of the main methodological claims I'm making. This polyphony is an ontological condition that my practice must grapple with. While it is easy to intellectually or discursively acknowledge this polyphony of material, of texts, of artwork, how can a practice do what it's doing, that is, have its own intentionality, make what it might of and from this material while keeping this polyphony in play? There is a tension here because on one hand, it is this very polyphony that allows me to purpose and repurpose material. I'll also get back to this. That is to extend my intentions onto it. But can I do so in a way that simultaneously attends or listens to that polyphony so as not to disrupt or interrupt it completely? So as not to fix its meaning in a way, but rather to acknowledge what that material may once have been, to let it tell me what it could become, to tune into the permanent possibility there is within each and every thing for real transformation, and to acknowledge that what is fixed, if anything, is then that, is its multiplicity, is its polyphony. That is also a multiplicity that is of temporalities that inhabit the material, not in different moments, but in every and in the very and every instance of my engagement with it. That is also to say that we don't just make something of the material we engage, but engaging material and how we engage with material has the capacity to transform us as well. In following and adapting from Julieta Singh in her book, Unthinking Mastery, which I'm grateful to my collaborator, Brooke Holmes, for pointing me to, and in this section from which I'm going to quote, Singh is advocating for what she calls a dehumanist education. And I quote, through which subject matter comes not merely to describe a topic of study, but to signal this physical matter that makes study possible. Coming to know ourselves through such an education must also be a radical narration and reorientation of what it is that we are aspiring to know, end quote, or what it is that we are aspiring to make in the case of what an exhibition can be. A dehumanist higher education, she writes, I quote again, would insist that knowledge production itself become unpredictable, unanticipatable, unmasterful. So to insist on this polyphony might be at once a kind of commonplace thing, but also perhaps the only ground I feel I have from which the task of what it means to listen to material and to be true to it might be taken on. This also then extends to the question of listening to the past. So the past as material, that the exhibition, A Slightly Curving Place, is asking. The exhibition was framed as, what does it mean to try and listen to the past somehow? And to that, not despite, but because of the way in which the past is also a frontier of right-wing politics and many other things. To insist then that the past is that which is abundant and multiple, and moreover, as something we cannot forsake. It is from within this frame that I see caring for a pre-modern past in our neoliberal present as an imperative, or as Brooke Holmes has invited us to consider, caring for our relation to the past as the curatorial project of occasioning and forming collectivities in the present. In doing this, also with another quite related angle in the project with Big Brooks that we are embarking on called Shifting Center, it's a way in which to consider research itself as an exercise in listening to and learning from others, an essentially communal and temporal practice that is not only rooted in the present, but looks for how past ways of knowing and practices of listening can inform an exhibition today. So, I mean, I spoke about basically the same object from these three vantage points, and to maybe demonstrate part of what I'm trying to say, but also to just break that down a little bit further from Uma's childhood memory and the story he tells. I learned about how he learned to work with what was available, right? To build what he could not afford, something he has continued to do till date. The ambisonic microphones he built to measure the acoustic properties of ancient archaeological sites once he realized that that was what he needs, which was at a point in the 90s, and he went to Rani Gumfa, was way out of his budget, right? It was not something that was available as it is today. And then he proceeded to spend almost the next decade building that. So to really build what you need. And that's something that to think of technology also then as a craft, right? The handmadeness of his microphones, for example. And that has been a practice that for him has never ended. It started with the Galena Crystal radio and it still continues in that strange, almost like he's flying off into the air device that you saw him a few slides ago. And therefore, and in the exhibition, we've also extended then the notion of technology to think about concepts as our technology. So the exhibition was framed through tuning, recording, digging, and how we reformed and reformulated what tuning, recording, and especially digging could mean. Listening as digging as a way of listening to different layers of sound that are in the same object of sound. And of course, to think of exhibitions themselves as our epistemic technologies, vitrines as machines. And the other thing I think I learned from that story of his was about working within one means, but moreover to extend that to not only building what one cannot afford, but building what cannot be bought. And so to think of that question in relation to exhibitions as occasioning an assembly of listeners, actually a phrase that Alex Keith introduced to the project as a collectivity that defies ownership, a collectivity across time and beyond possession. In the vitrine object, and the way in which that was described, I was most interested in delineating the labor of listening. That listening is not something we just do because we close our ears, but that it involves and must involve a concerted effort, a practice in itself, something that I've also learned immensely from Maushami Bhaumik and Shrikanta Majumdar from the Traveling Archives. And in later on in life, Uma Shankar would say that he didn't used to ever pay attention to spaces when he was working as a sound recordist, but in a way, attending to how he started listening and could make out the difference between Radio Moscow and the BBC gave me a sense that, in fact, this is something he's been doing thinking, like listening to the acoustic property of spaces was something that he was doing from a longer time than he was maybe even thinking of it as such. And the Galena Crystal itself is the tiniest object in the exhibition. It's a lead ore, and it's actually full of impurities. So you move a cat's whisker on the surface of this very tiny crystal to find a point amidst all that impurity through which the current can flow, right? Through which radio waves from the ether could be accessed, and the transmission can kind of come through. And both this idea of the impure nature of the material that we're engaging, as well as this idea of like some things having to align, or many things having to align as part of the labor that curatorial labor constitutes, was also, in fact, an earlier version of the talk was titled Curator as Semiconductor, and the semi-ness of it was also something that was attractive to me. And sometimes he would say that the Galena Crystal you found also wouldn't work, right? It didn't, and so there's no way of knowing in advance. Nobody used to believe him in the house that he could actually hear anything until he could report the cricket scores, and I think that idea that in researching the Galena Crystal radio, which was popular at the turn of the century and then grew commercially obsolete, this idea that at the time the properties, the way in which a semiconductor worked was not something that was fully kind of scientifically grasped, and that therefore there were comments made about this kind of operation being a mystical one, and to think of everything that happens so far as collaborations and or even process, like research as process, like in the exhibition today you will see a lot of images of the sites we went to, but none of these images were pictured in the exhibition, right? And that was a decision. There are many things to say about that, which we will get to later as well. But it's also an access. I mean, this idea of even if you're not working in the same kind of research format as perhaps I'm going to be describing today, there is something that remains invisible, both in terms of the privilege of access that curatorial positions occupy, and at the same time, I would also argue that an invisibility that perhaps needs to remain as such, right? Like that there is invisible labor that, that perhaps is better that way. So there's a tension there, right? Like there's a tension, that access of also, in some cases, the access to artists and to where their work emerges from is something that is denied the audience, and there would be a question there as to whether perhaps the relation to the artist or the relation to the practice is something that can come into the exhibition. And so I guess I'm saying both things, right? Like I'm saying in some cases or in some angles, this kind of question of the invisible processes and how that can be the thing that the exhibition is, right? Like how can listening be the thing that the exhibition does, or invites one to do. So I'm going to kind of take my cue from the radio and kind of shift a few channels and move between mostly 2 or 3 projects without necessarily tying it all together. And I also take the liberty of doing that. We recently did a film program in Dubai called a supplementary country called Cinema, which was programmed by myself and Silpi Sharma. And one of the key kind of, the film that started this program off for me was a film called Hawa Mahal by Vipin Vijay. And I've thought about it in many ways, insofar as a film in which sound and image are of their own volition, but share the space and time of the film, and to think that structural kind of condition is also something that curators and artists could do, like be of their own volition, but share the space and time of an exhibition. This was way back when I started, but there was a way in which Surbhi then articulated her reading of the film in relation to what we were doing that I take my liberty from this. Hawa Mahal treats the film as if it were a radio and seeks out sonic waves in fortuitous ways without chronology or connection. Okay, so there are a lot of names that were on that screen, and they were all the collaborators for the exhibition, which are also growing in number as we move forward. Many of them were key, and their names will come up and have already come up today. But I just wanted them to be there for a minute for that. Okay. So this is an entirely different project, and the reason I bring it up here is to stay close to the kind of material question that we're dealing with. It's a collaborative project with Mala Kalmi, an artist based in Cairo, and much of what I will read today is co-authored with her. Conceived as an exercise in addressing the social, intellectual, and psychic legacies of entering and leaving collaborations, Emotional Architecture is a project initiated with Mala Kalmi in Cairo in 2012. In thinking through a range of situations, from minor artist collectives and temporary social movements to grand historical narratives, we began by asking what happens to knowledge that was born in collaboration when collaborations break up, which often they do. We talk together with friends about how certain dynamics of power become apparent, like a ghost, say, of an underlying governing structure, but only in moments of emotional involvement and heightened awareness in which a threshold has been reached. We wanted to articulate what it is that comes to be known in these encounters with one's own ideological and or physiological limits, specifically in relation to collective contexts in which the soul is at work. We tried to contain these events in language, and we commissioned our collaborators to write as much as possible from the edges of their interdisciplines: journalism, activism, filmmaking, education, comedy, philosophy, anthropology, and art history. What we found instead was that meaning breaks down and that it grows harder to speak with conviction when we no longer inhabit those conditions and can no longer see the apparition. Our engagement with these concerns happened to have developed at a particular political disjunction, during which the ground of our analysis kept moving and the rules no longer applied. A series of publications came out of this process. The first is titled, we started by calling it The Summer of Two Fires and a Landslide, and it includes text and image-based contributions by Haik Avesian, Claire Davies, myself, and Malak. It was printed in October 2014. The second is titled No Fantasy Without Protest, and it comprises essays by Lina Atala, Mu'taz Atala, and Philip List. It was printed in September 2015. So the first publication, we can change the slide. The first publication we put out was concerned with notions of spontaneous combustion and material refusal in relation to the incineration of significant buildings in Cairo at various points of its history, particularly responding to a 5-week period in August and September 2008. It was a time during which we felt that animate and inanimate forms in the city began to shed and exchange their properties, performing the behavior of the other and possessing action and color at will. The particular historical context of this combustion was marked by the absence of a certain possibility of speech and also a certain possibility of protest. The People's Assembly Archive and the Shura Council, or the Upper House of Parliament, which could be thought of as the corridor of political decision-making, and the National Theatre, or the site of spectacle, arguably one of the more prominent stages of cultural production in the region, both burned down just weeks from each other. So both culture and politics blow up in a sense. It was a time of total contagion, seemingly orchestrated, yet attributable to none. It was as if the mere anarchy of witnessing could cause an accidental, uncoordinated, collective event. So at a time when certain things were being suppressed and could not actually be said or even imagined, other things stepped in to act from that space of speech, or perhaps in the place of that speech, and in turn decided to kind of protest. In the event of the Upper House of Parliament, the Parliament burning, people gathered in the street to watch a spectacle of state burning. Could this act of watching the heat of these bodies gathering in the street, as they had done so before and would do so again, have initiated a possibility and opening up of an imagination which was not available before? There's a string of moments in the research around this project where somehow evidence precedes the event. And I guess there's a question about there as well as to kind of how one knows what one knows. Say for the end of a regime, an imagination that was already watching, that then would slowly enter consciousness and speak and become a possibility. It was a fantastic fire. The building was old and largely made of wood. Fire engines from the station 5 minutes away took hours to arrive. A single helicopter scooped water from the Nile. People gathered there in the streets, not only not believing their eyes, but looking to the lens of phone cameras as if in confirmation. Some of what we felt at the time and were doing and thinking through in order to ask questions to history. Questions such as, what did the burning building know? What might it have been saying? What world was it opening itself up to? Because it did feel at the time that this act of like demolition or this was an act of material protest. In that sense, we have tried to understand the language of fire. What was being said in that moment when certain things consumed themselves and ate themselves up. The burning of these buildings can be thought of in relation to the electrical short circuit, which, at least in the case of 2008, was what the fires were attributed to. Insofar as the state's narrative, not much else was ever declared. An electrical short circuit, as per its definition, often results from an unintended contact of components and the consequent accidental diversion of a current. We can think about the notion of the short circuit in relation to 3 possible cinematic tropes. In popular cinema, short circuits are gateways to other dimensions, whereby a freak accident or incident, we arrive at the opening of other possible worlds that are governed by a different, often uncanny set of codes and rules. So an opening up to a world where something which in this world may be unbelievable and unimaginable, but then in that world is entirely possible. So we began thinking about the idea of emotional architecture in relation to the notion of collaboration, and a lot has been said and written about collaboration in the art context. These texts are both reflexive in that they consider how collaboration operates within the art context, as well as expansive in that they extend to consider conditions of labor, of work in the world. We started to think about the fact that there's not much said about the emotional register of collaboration, of what forms, sustains, supports, and props up collaboration. What is its infrastructure or architecture? How does power operate within it? In thinking through a range of situations, from minor artist collectives and temporary social movements to grand historical narratives, we began by asking what happens to knowledge that was born in collaborations when collaborations break up. So grand narratives in the sense of how does one break up with history or with the canon, you might say. We talked together with friends about, this I mentioned, sorry, before. So what are the social, intellectual, and psychic legacies of entering and leaving collaborations is not so much a question of what one claims after collaboration insofar as an ownership of ideas, but rather of how one survives them. And perhaps more importantly, looked at the other way, what is it that survives collaboration? What is it that remains as residue or as excess? What is the thing that surpasses the end of a collaboration? I think I will go ahead to the slightly curving place slides. Yeah. So we're gonna basically, I'm gonna think through this kind of question of the exhibition, an exhibition of listening, and I'm gonna start that by sharing a small clip from the video that was made of the exhibition, and the work that you're gonna hear now is by the Traveling Archive, Moshimi and Shukantu, and it's just an excerpt of their work, and they also had two other pieces. This one is called Burrowing. I think you have to go back.
The train moves to its own beat. The train moves to its own beat, now in fast steps, now slow, halts, then starts again, chugging along. It makes a sound loud enough to drown all other. People's talk, children's cry. The tea seller comes with his kettle and paper cups. I sit by my window, thinking, listening, and recording, even talking. There are people everywhere. Their bodies brush against the fluffy cap of my little recorder. I hold it closer. Burrowing through these lateral shafts of sound, The song of the blind singer is coming towards my mic. And I hear her voice long before I see her, like the wind that precedes a train in a tunnel. Like Turner's engine, she seems to come from the past to meet my recorder, now in the present, and then she moves on.
There's so much to say about that work itself, and hopefully we can get to that a bit, but I'm not going to just kind of talk through the exhibition or through some framing in relation to the exhibition. So was the exhibition a slightly curving place about Uma Shankar Mantravadi? And aboutness is a kind of preoccupation of mine, which, I mean, I guess I understand aboutness as a philosophical concept, which is wide-ranging in its, range that relates to subject matter and intentionality, right? So I just want to, put the question of aboutness to the fore, and is something that keeps coming back. So was the exhibition a slightly curving place about Uma Shankar Mantravadi, a self-taught acoustic archaeologist based in Bangalore? What is going on when something is made to be about something else? And what is at stake in resisting such a claim, such as by saying the exhibition was not about Uma Shankar Mantravadi, but rather with him? I won't be getting to the with today, but to stay with the about, as I said, it's a wide-ranging philosophical concept that relates to subject matter and intentionality. What I'm doing by invoking it is inviting us to consider not only the ways in which an exhibition can be about a person and a practice, but also how relieving the exhibition of that responsibility might compel us to confront the material that constituted the exhibition on other terms as well. This is to move towards recognizing all the parts that matter plays in making meaning and composing sense. For those of you who may not know, Uma Shankar was born in 1945 and began his career as a journalist with the Indian Express in Madras in 1967. He quit the newspaper in 1976, a year into the emergency imposed by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, during which civil liberties, including freedom of press, were severely curtailed. The decision dramatically changed the course of his life. He moved to Delhi without a job and ended up working as a freelance sound recordist for independent film and television productions. During this time, he was approached by Nazir Jaraz Boy, founding chair of the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA, to help set up the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology, now in Gurgaon, where he served as head technician from its inception in 1982 until he retired 33 years later. Having assembled his first radio as a young boy in 1950, he continues to build audio technology, loudspeakers, amplifiers, and microphones, whether in his spare time, because he enjoys it, or when the equipment he requires is beyond his means. He calls himself a hobbyist. It is of no small significance that he has also been composing poems since the age of 17. So Uma Shankar details this journey that equipped him for the field of acoustic archaeology in this essay that I mentioned. And then there are annotations as well that are made by Eunice Fong that run alongside his personal and professional trajectory, and in a way kind of run through the second half of the 20th century into the present. And these then get entangled in a multidimensional web of like disparate cultural, political, and technological events. So it's in a way of thinking through kind of the multiplicity of a single biography as well. And that was one of our modes to kind of do that. This underscores the project's assertion that Uma Shankar is a history of sound and technology. He is also, which is nothing if not a history of listening. And I think this kind of question of sound and technology in relation to what a history of listening is and can be Once a journalist and still a poet, he's also no stranger to writing. At some point, in reckoning with his own transition from working at the newspaper to becoming a sound recordist for film, he found a connection between what might have seemed two separate walks of his life. Writing is a sound recording device. This is the ground on which then the publication we're making and in the way in which we engage also with text in general to deliver another proclamation, right? Reading is listening. And I think, you know, while I'll get to this also a little later, but like while Uma Shankar's practice is oriented towards what it means to listen to the acoustics of archaeological sites, we extended that notion to what it means to listen to text, not just to the sound of what, you know, the words sound like, but other registers of listening to text that that can happen. In other words, sound is inscribed in text, and reading, whether out loud or in our heads, entails the possibility of playing it back again. In reading Uma Shankar, we are listening to him. That is, we are listening to listening. It was only in the mid-1990s that Uma made his first concerted effort to listen to a space, a basic principle in acoustic archaeology. It happened in response to an invitation to collaborate from the late Cecile Thomas Ault, professor of theater history and stage design at Indiana University in Pennsylvania. Tom had wanted to explore a premise that an ancient archaeological site called Rani Gumpa, or the Queen's Cave, a double-storied rock-cut structure near Bhubaneswar, was an open-air theater, and he approached Uma Shankar to produce acoustic measurements that might substantiate the same. Back then, neither of them necessarily knew what that would entail. Together, they went to Rani Gumpa, the largest and most elaborate of a group of 33 cave structures, carved out of the honeycombed hills of Udaigiri and its nearby twin, Kandagiri. They began by measuring its physical. Sorry, you're looking at Sita Benga and not at Rani Gumpa, but that's okay. Tom had once been married to Sharon Lowen, an eminent Odissi dancer. This contemporary classical form stakes its claim for its representational origins, as Anurama Banerjee, another contributor to the exhibition, to the friezes. So the series of friezes at Rani Gumpa, where its early antecedent, called Odra Magadhi, was allegedly cultivated and performed. A book by Devendra Dash, an actor and director, makes a conjecture that Rani Gumpa had been constructed on tenets laid out for stage design in the ancient Sanskrit compendium for the performing arts called Natya Shastra. And he even built a wooden maquette to prove the same. Now, Uma Shankar, and this is really crucial for the project, was critical of the tendency towards a technological positivism. And he was certain that his measurements, from the beginning, insofar as his narrative, that his measurements could be evidence of nothing but themselves. Nonetheless, he was curious to make them. And I think this kind of question of the journey of making the measurements without necessarily knowing, what that would yield, or with a kind of skepticism to kind of the notion of proof, of evidence, is also something that has kind of been quite crucial to how the project itself engages technology towards other means. So this idea of also repurposing technology, repurposing our material for other ends. The Archaeological Survey of India identifies these caves as comprising a row of cells and designates these to have essentially been dormitories for Jain ascetics. The nearby Hathi Gumpa inscription in Prakrit, and attributed to King Karavela, who ruled Kalinga around the second half of the 1st century BCE, seems to vouch as much, that these caves were excavated to provide retreat during rainy season, as well as other things. A tourist information board outside the site declares that the inference that the caves had been designated as resting places for monks is substantiated by a slope rising off the floor at the rear end to serve the purpose of a pillow. That's a quote. When Uma Shankar got there, he went in and laid down to find the incline terribly uncomfortable. He too thought that the curvatures had a function, but it was to accentuate the capacity of the caves to serve as resonant chambers, a pre-modern speaker system. That is to say, if Rani Gumfa is in fact a performance space, then it had been shaped in a particular way so as to amplify and carry sound across the plain, where an audience of 1,000 may be seated. Or, as Uma Shankar once explained to me early on in our ongoing conversation, standing on that stage was like standing in the mouth of a horn, inside an instrument carved out of a rock face.
Nida, we might have 10 more minutes.
Okay, cool. But how could this have been done? Was there a science to it? Even today, with all the technological advancements that have been made, it is impossible to prototype such a process exactly, at least not when it comes to the acoustics of a space. Models are made, but cannot predict how the sound will be. This prompted Uma Shankar to consider that people were listening to the spaces they were building as they were building them. It was a profound encounter with an acoustic sensibility that he felt had been lost along the way, and he directed his energies towards developing a framework for its appreciation. And this is what his project urges. We can't just look for theaters and landscapes of the past, we must listen for them. So Uma Shankar's project engenders a shift in the discourse of archaeology, especially as it has evolved through the Archaeological Survey of India in various stages since its establishment in 1861 as a primarily visual study, from its focus on numismatics and inscription towards thinking about the sound of an event. This disrupts the focus on material evidence that has, at least since the advent of archaeology in the 19th century, structurally conditioned the ways in which the past has come to be known. As a vector of modernity that evolved as a primarily visual study, the discipline of archaeology can be charged with colonizing the past and corroborating with the museum by collecting it for display. But an archaeological site is not only about ruins and artifacts, it is also a record of everything that happened there. Measuring sound waves moving through the muted material archive of architecture shifts the archaeological gaze towards acoustic reflections. Echoes that bounce off of walls, floors, columns, chambers, and ceilings carry a trace of bygone events that have not entered history, like a latent memory of a collective experience that defies ownership. Uma Shankar's very act of going to a site and making such measurements is a reminder of the potential of performance still inherent in the material archive that is the site itself. So the exhibition, I guess, was also framed as to like, what is the relationship between the archaeological site and the exhibition? And in a way, the practices of the various contributors that comprise the exhibition somehow extend the notion of an archaeological site to think of not only what it means to listen to an archaeological site, but to listen to text, to listen to song as sight, to listen to the field recording. And in a way, like this question of asking what it means to listen to the past was a way in which to kind of think through whether sound too is buried under layers of time. If so, can it be excavated? What tools would be needed? What senses activated? So echoes, and I guess in kind of closing up by thinking of this question of exhibition as listening, one of the propositions there are two questions. One is, what does it mean to listen to the past, to echoes that have not been recorded, of events that did not enter history? And two, what is at stake ontologically and politically in thinking of the space and time of sound, its volume and its duration as an exhibition? So in carrying out the an exploration of the epistemic technologies involved in the labor of listening, not just to sound, but to images and objects and text sets as well, the project hopes to make a proposition towards what an exhibition that occasions an assembly of listeners could be. And I guess the field of, I mean, just to think of the field of exhibition studies as well, as something that Yazia Velázquez in her 2019 essay, Who Needs Exhibition Studies, defends as one that starts from the idea that there's nothing self-evident about exhibition, and moreover understands itself in trans-generational and transdisciplinary alliance with the institutional histories and political struggles of museum workers, mainly from the global South, who have refused to accept the commonsensical notion of a museum and of what an exhibition can be. So these histories and struggles, she argues, have been largely obliterated from the curriculum of courses on curatorial studies, which in turn have primarily been oriented toward the model of a curator of contemporary art, often working as an artist. So in a 2009 essay called Politics of Installation, Boris Groys lays out what he considers to be the main distinction between an artistic installation and a curated exhibition, claiming that the former rests on the sovereign freedom of the artist and expands this domain from the individual art object to that of the exhibition space, while the latter claims to remain as a function of the curator as an institution in herself, fundamentally obligated to the public. Velázquez warns of the danger of turning the exhibition into the art object itself, whether in the hands of the artist or the curator, because then those limits of the art objects are merely reinstituted at a different level of the exhibition. So to consider the space and time of sound, its volume and its duration as an exhibition is one of the kind of conceptual propositions that the exhibition was making. You had a series of vitrines that you encountered outside, but when you entered, the space was quote unquote empty, but full of sound, right? And of course, the works were laid out in time, one after the other. But if we think through how the material qualities of an echo work, we could also be the idiot philosophers and argue that all the works were there at the same time. So it's a way of also kind of reconceiving the boundaries between art and its public to see if we could fundamentally understand our understanding of what the nature of an encounter that is an exhibition could be. So the space and time of sound are simultaneously inhabited by the practices that compose the exhibition as well as by those attending it. In thinking of the exhibition as occasioning an assembly of listeners, I just also want to end by saying that my intention is not to privilege the medium of sound in the making and displaying of art. So this is not about a category of sound art, nor is it about advocating for a multi-sensory museum strategy, but rather, again, to take up this kind of ontological multiplicity of sound, or the polyphony of materiality that is much debated, so as to shift our attention and find the language for what the labor of listening actually is. And so what are the body and cultural techniques involved in practices of listening? How are they transmitted? And what kind of history of listening can we tell? I'm going to stop there for now. Thank you all.
Yeah, give me a second. My screen is stuck, so I'm not able to stop sharing. It's moving on its own. Oh, there we go. Yes, so thank you so much, Nida, for such an extensive presentation, lucid presentation, and elaborating on what the space process of exhibition making, thinking, listening means to you, and the materials that you bring and also decide not to bring to it. So I'm particularly grateful for bringing and highlighting the aspect of labor of listening, and not just the curatorial labor, but also the labor of the visitors, of the other listeners, and which kind of makes the exhibition as a medium or as a language in itself, which is performed in duration and in relation.
Right.
So not only consumed or to be contained by the spatial architecture or of the institution or of the settings that enable it and infrastructures that enable it. So that kind of that's very important, at least to me as well. So thanks for doing that, and so which also brings us to thinking with the acts that are required for the publics to be able to tune into, and tuning in is your word again. So I thought maybe we can spend more time maybe on your proposition of curator as a semiconductor, this and also listening, and this role of semiconducting or conducting between different entities, and where there also with impurities and resistances, you say. So what would be your resistances, in these large projects with involving so many multiple collaborators? So, I just wanted to quickly get to from what I've understood, in your work also, listening to the materials is also is not a passive act. It's also speaking to the materials at the same time. So listening as a method then is an active co-production of the work itself. So which also then changes or expands the material. And so how do you respond to this huge changes that happen to the subject itself? And are there any conflict zones for you, or pacing yourself in this moment of not knowing? Does that cause something? And about that difficulty.
I mean, there's obviously these things are, my initial impulse is to also answer this question really kind of insofar as both the practical as well as the circumstantial, right? There were many resistances, I would say, in some, not so many, but the invitation to curate a show in relation to, let's say, unavoidably by virtue of the list of sites that Uma Shankar had in mind or had already been to, by virtue of the accident of his birth, and to curate a show that was, at least in the onset, primarily concerned with archaeological sites in pre-modern India at a place called the House of World Cultures, and how to do that and yet not do that, right? So there was a level of and I guess one way to answer how we made the decisions, some of the decisions that we made, we had a workshop at Hakabe, quite local, except for Uma, who had come in 2019 to begin to imagine the form, or also to begin to imagine who the collaborators. I think I had my first conversation with Alex about the project right after that workshop, and I guess one thing that happened in that workshop, which was a semi-closed small affair with artists and thinkers in Berlin, was that there was an immense amount of specificity to what Uma Shankar, as someone who I could also think of as having spent a lot of his life listening to the archives of ARCE, for example. He says something like in the first 5-7 years, up to 5 to 7 hours a day. So as an archive of listening itself. And what we did during that workshop was listen, right? Listen to each other, and in a very particular attention to what listening could be, even though that wasn't necessarily pronounced as such at the time. And what I came away with from that workshop was not necessarily knowing what the form was, but knowing that, oh, this is maybe an oral tradition, or maybe, that, and how can an exhibition not be about that, but do that, right? So, but in terms of the question of resistance, there was either an option of kind of going comparative, like thinking of, the acoustic archaeology question in a broader sense, or actually going straight to the specificities of the sites and the specificities of the practices that we were engaging, and taking that, kind of head on, knowing that we were doing this in a context where, maybe most visitors won't know what where Rani Gumpa is, or, and in a way there was a level of like naming and not naming things, framing and not framing things, but and the way I've kind of thought about this is like, if we think about the demand for a narrative, and then we think about Homi Bhabha's, this Derrida, Homi Bhabha, Feroz Basunia are all talking also of this refusal of that demand for a narrative, how to kind of refuse the demand but not the form of narrative, right? So I think that is the kind of tension or the resistance, right? To kind of go all in and do any of these sites and any of these practices that we were engaging in, all their specificities, so as not to give up on narrative itself, and yet to find a way where that that narrative is in kind of framed as, let us bring you an ancient site in India to the House of World Culture. So I think that was one of the major kind of questions for how we were navigating some of the resistances that we had even within ourselves. The other was like, whether to do, like, I was very interested in an exhibition that was without objects, right? Like, so as you enter the main space, there are no, like, there's no antiquities for sure, right? So how do you do the past without without the kind of modes that we usually encounter the past in an exhibition? And so then the materiality question, not in an obvious sense, seems to be upturned, but in fact, what happens when you think of not only sound as material, but as I was saying, like voice as raw material. So we actually recorded in a lot of some of the archaeological sites that Uma Shankar was measuring, recorded scripts that were written by Alex Keefe and performed by various actors, and Shukanthu Mazumdar, like really has made me think about like what is happening at a site when you're recording a voice in a site. You're recording, sure, there's the site is in the recording, because especially if you're using an ambisonic microphone, you are not only recording the voice, but you're recording the site as well. But there's a way in which just the affective register of what it means to be in a site and perform in a site, you might be feeling awe, or you might be feeling, something, is also something that registers on the voice. Right. So this is this kind of idea of like also the voice becoming a surface. Right. So what does this mean for how we think of surfaces in the exhibitions that we maybe more often tend to make? This is just to kind of expand on the kind of question of, on one hand, there was this resistance to maybe material objects in the show, to some degree, and in fact there were many, right? We had vitrines full of objects, and that was something that we were on the fence about till quite late, and even though we knew what they would be, and the reason that I'm glad we did that were maybe two. One is that I think the show would definitely have become an art object without them. And so there was a kind of responsibility to kind of think through the very like this kind of proposition of vitrines as machines. Like, what are vitrines doing? You have an object and you have language or text that goes alongside it. And can you do something such that these two things change each other, right? Like, can the text change the object, for example? And so those were so each object kind of had a way in which it was trying to deal with that tension, or yeah.
And what's very interesting for me is so listening in that sense is also a replaying of the event. And in that replaying, it's not the first occurrence, and that acknowledgement is within the form itself, and that's pretty beautiful. So maybe
that's it's sorry. My friend Haitham Wardani, once I was working on a text which has to do with the archival recordings from World War I prisoners of war from South Asia in Berlin, and at some point he said something like, every listening is a re-listening. And in the moment I was like, yes, and then yes, in the sense that you are saying it as well, but then when you think about the structure of sound, and you think about that there is no sound without space, in a way that I'm speaking, even though with all of this technological apparatus that we're inhabiting at the moment, insofar as the space between us, you hear my voice. If we were in a room together, you hear my voice directly coming at you, but also echoing, bouncing off the walls and echoing. So in the instance of your listening, there is already a re-listening, so to speak.
Yeah, and I wanted to quickly bring our focus and attention to maybe this growing nomenclature of research exhibitions. So I thought it could be very interesting to unpack it with you, because this is the nomenclature that I'm myself also kind of inclined towards, and try to frame my work or articulate my work in that sense. At least the way I see it, the category of research-based exhibitions like that. Not something that doesn't necessarily engages with the researcher simply laying out of the archival or historical data, material, or stories or narratives. Rather it presents a contemporary interjection or an active methodological intervention through which one can address or instigate a kind of a very urgent quality or analysis of the present. So it's very much in the present. So the archived object or the vitrines or the other vehicular things are just one element of it. So it allows a bit more flexibility and and a path away from the usual hierarchy of materials that we come to deal with, and the relationship, a different range of relationships can be set between different materials. So I was wondering, what do you see? How do you see your work? Do you see it in this category, or what do you think of this valency or function of research exhibitions per se?
As I was saying to you, it's hard at this moment to kind of theorize what I'm doing as I'm doing it. Of course, there's an immense amount of research involved. And I guess I would say two things. In the making of this show, for example, at some point I really just stopped reading, for example, right? And I think it really, the learning that happened was really in and to and with everyone else involved in the show. And I think I learned things about what listening is and can be that I did not and could not have known otherwise. There were also, so I guess there's a durational question, right? Like there's the question of like, how long does one, how long does one stay with things in a way? And I guess, when Uma is going to a site and measuring it and coming back, like what does one do with this measurement, for example? And it is in a way just his attending to the site, or as he started to say, he realized at some point that these were places that people were listening to as they were building them. and what does it mean for us to listen to them. So it's a shift of attention, I guess, and the research then becomes about these research trips that we make, right? Like the kind of journey to the site that is not necessarily pictured in the exhibition is the thing that has happened and has happened to us and has changed, something in what we understand of what we are doing, in a way that is kind of the collective research process that is, as I was saying earlier, not necessarily present, but yet the entire project is constituted by it, right? And in a way, and I think that idea of research as practice or research as process that kind of constitutes the space from which the exhibition is made somehow, rather than maybe perhaps only thinking of it as, what is the material that is displayed. So even though there was a lot of like older material, like I think the mode in which we engaged with it, there was always also a kind of something poetic about it. And so I don't know how that would fit into the research exhibition category per se. So I think it's a very open. For me, it's an unresolved question as to whether I would categorize my work as a research exhibition, which is not to say that there's not a lot of research in it.
I've had a lot of elaborations to do, so I think I quickly jumped at it. So and find my alliances. There are a couple of questions here from Abhishek Hazra. So maybe I can read them out to you. So the first one that he's asking is, within the wide philosophical range of the concept of aboutness, what are some of the key points of interest for you? Connected to the question of intentionality, aboutness of something might also be closely connected to incommensurable subjection positions.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I'm still quite early on in the use of this kind of philosophical terrain, and the book I'm reading is also very dense, and I think for me it really began. I mean, at some point when I had some distance from a lot of the writing that I was doing vis-a-vis invitations often by artists, right, who were in, that at some point I picked up that often, more recently, there was an invitation to write in relation to work or in relation to a project, but also this kind of openness that you don't have to write about the work at all, right? And for me, this, this kind of like, what is going on here when an artist asks you to write about a work, and says, and also says you don't have to write about the work at all, and I think that's, and can we write about art in the first place? So I think, for me, this is kind of, I'm also very, like, a key text for me is an essay, a chapter in Samuel Weber's Benjamin's Abilities called Criticizability, where he's talking about Benjamin's notion of it's not necessarily about writing about art is not about judgment, is it good or bad, right? But rather this kind of supplanting it in the alien soil of knowledge, right? And so I think the question is, it is about very much about intentionality, but the fact, and this I think connects to the kind of claims I'm trying to grapple with vis-a-vis this material, as polyphonic, as an ontological condition, is, how do these multiplicities kind of cohabit the same space and time, right? Like, in a way, off text. And this has to do both with the intentionality of the writer, but also how the multiple ways in which text can be read, right? So, I think it's somewhere yeah, it's somewhere there. Insofar as it's a processual question as well. Like, how does one, kind of keep that that openness? How does one kind of deal with this ontological? And I think I've made a shift, like, to go from like thinking about, on ontological and big video uncertainty, to think about that, multiplicity as the ontological condition itself.
So he's asking another question. And he also says thanks for this fascinating answer to aboutness. So he's saying, I propose the labor of listening. I'm thinking of the historical context of ethnomusicology as disciplinary infrastructure. Without necessarily recapitulating the familiar critique of Orientalism, it would be interesting to hear more on what you consider to be the contemporary legacy of the discourse of ethnomusicology.
I mean, this is a question for Mosh. I wish Moshmi was here. So for example, if I may just speak briefly of, like, it's not a question. I mean, I'm not going to kind of say, so Maushami Bhaumik works, and she recently also finished her PhD. We started working in 2012-13 together, and at that point she was beginning to get very engrossed with the collection of Arnold Bakke, the recordings that the Dutch ethnomusicologist made, not only in Bengal and around, but I mean all around the country, also at sea, and as the Traveling Archive as a project goes to a lot of the places that Arnold Bakke may have made recordings in, but also makes their own recordings, and if there's anyone that I've learned what listening to listening can be, it is through Maushami's practice, which involves working with this legacy or this history or this archive of ethnomusicology through the focus on the work of Arnold Bakke, but also continues to record in the field, right? And there are sometimes it takes, the nature of a wax cylinder recording where the sound has faded, or you can only hear, depending on how it's been digitized, you more or less hear the sound of the wax cylinder rotating, and the sound itself has totally maybe faded. But through the practice of not only listening to these recordings on her own and with Shukanto, but also going to the field and then finding, the family whose ancestors may have been recorded on these wax cylinders, at times, sometimes taking years to actually, find them. And often these are musical traditions and practices that have kind of been passed down, and you and I may not be able to hear a song on this, and maybe the song is not even there anymore because it's old and faded, but someone who already knows the song, as she likes to say, will hear it before it even starts and sing back, right? And there's this labor of the work that she has been doing that is just so full of layers and layers of richness. And for me, I mean, just to kind of push that through, like, there are Shrikanta and Maushami also, for example, in the clip that I showed, which is from the opening track of the exhibition, and I don't have the kind of experience of field recording as they do, or of this the music traditions that they have been recording and listening to. But when I heard that blind singer's voice, it's a sound that somehow there is something that in hearing, and knowing, you don't know that you're going to they don't know that they're going to find this song on this train on that journey, right? But when they hear it, they know that that's the sound that they're looking to record. So I think there's just just a wealth of ways in which the Traveling Archive has kind of engaged both critically with the field of ethnomusicology, but also continue to do field recordings, and the ways in which both, often Moshami is also kind of filling, for example, the gaps, right? Like going into the archive and saying, who the singers on the track are, because sometimes those weren't taken down. It was just the tradition that was taken down. So there's labor here too of, not only, and sometimes there's a way in which in her work, for example, she's taken a recording and gone to the field and is listening to it with people who may know, family members who may know what was on it, and recording that listening session. And then coming back and listening to them, listening to that listening. And then there are times where she's giving a presentation. And I think this was like one of the early moments in this round of collaboration. There were earlier moments as well, where I was listening to a presentation of hers and I was like, so there's the sound of the wax cylinder somewhere there. There's a group of people listening to the sound that is coming out from the wax cylinder, and they're talking and discussing what might this be, etc. Then there's Moshami giving this presentation, and then there's me listening to it. And there are all these, in this instance of sound, all this time is there. All these times are there. And so I think, yes, the field of, this is not a direct answer. I'm not a expert on ethnomusicology per se, but I would say that there. And I think I'll say just one more thing, like in back to the, I'm actually going to, if you give me a second, back to the, phonogram archive and the Laut archive, both archives in Berlin that have prisoner of war recordings in them. Sorry. There's a way in which, like today, what researchers who are working with these archives are able to hear in these archives, for example, in these voices, that people who were being recorded didn't feel like they were being listened to. The fact that today we can hear that they felt that they were not being heard is, I think, full of kind of potential, right? That we can hear someone else's experience of inaudibility, also kind of opens up the possibility of how we engage the field of ethnomusicology, which of course is also then a field that only becomes to be named as such in the 1950s, but of course dates back from, to an earlier moment. So yeah, there's a lot to say, I guess.
Thanks for elaborating extensively and adding to this idea of fading and some kind of sense of loss. Shukla Sawant has an anecdote. She's saying she recalls being in a presentation with Uma Shankar and Brinda Grover, where he spoke about phone recordings in connection with police evidence submitted for a pending death sentence. He spoke of how Uma Shankar spoke of how noise and dust accumulate and distort recordings, making every piece of evidentiary material suspect. I was thinking of forensic possibilities of listening carefully and the precarity of life hanging on words pronounced, mispronounced, and distorted by dust.
It's amazing how I've been speaking to Uma for so many years now, and there's still new things that I don't know that he's done. So I actually don't know this particular. I think the forensic question is so I guess the project is really kind of thinking through the question of evidence differently and not necessarily through the legal paradigm of evidence. And I think there's a big question there. I mean, I'm not, this is in relation to like how the question of technological positivism, as I was bringing up, you know, to kind of prove that this site was something, like, you know, we know where that, you know, where that leads us. And so there is, you know, I think there is a kind of, but the question I think is much more nuanced. I mean, is a great one, and I think in different ways, you know, the kind of question of obviously this doesn't come up in recording the acoustic properties of a site necessarily, right? Like I don't think I'm sorry, I think that I wouldn't be able to answer because I guess we aren't dealing with legal evidence related things. But what the question does make me think about is maybe things that I've already expanded on in through talking about Maushami's work, is that exactly there are layers and layers of things going on in, you know, in any little bit of sound, right? So I mean, this is something that Shukantu points us to. We don't even need archival sound to know, you know, you can hear a plastic bag floating around, and there's history in that as well, right? There's evidence in that as well. If we pay attention to what it is that we are listening to, there's much more, and you know, he insofar as sound as an object, right? The sound object in the piece of sound, and I think this question kind of relates to that.
Yeah, and the question of silence is an important one there.
Mm-hmm.
And to that effect, we have a question from Parivartan Mohanty. In today's context of social media and echo chambers, I feel the act of listening or the domain of sound has become very hierarchical. There are constant threat of fear to be or not to be heard, overheard, made silent, or muted. How do you see this aspect of sound, which is not very different from other materials? Yeah, and also why you and other co-directors, co-artistic directors of Singapore Biennale have closed your eyes in the cover photo. Is it an act of listening or not looking or seeing? Maybe this could be the last question we take.
Sorry, the first one
you
was?
can choose not to. Yeah.
I think this. So I mean, it's hard for me to say. I'm not on social media, but I think
echo chambers. Yeah.
Yeah. So the premise of the exhibition is that we cannot. There isn't sound from the past that is being presented in this exhibition, right? So you start from. The exhibition kind of starts from that ground that there is no past here to be listened to, certainly not in the exhibition itself, right? But rather to extend, you know, in a way, as I keep saying, like what listening can be, right? So in a way, it's not only about listening with our ears on one hand. And I think that's also what I was saying, that this is not about privileging the medium of sound. As you know, this is not about privileging the medium of sound vis-a-vis evidence, vis-a-vis history, but rather just thinking of the fact that we have not been listening, or you know, as a way of tuning into the static of the past, to reckon with the noise of the present, to also hear then those, or ask what it means to try and hear those who have, like, you know, also reserved their right to remain silent, right? So there's I think it's not about. I mean, I totally understand the kind of, which is also why, like, this project is not about sound art. You'll have to wait to answer it for the second question.
I have tons of questions to ask you, but we have already run past our due time given to us. So maybe we can end our conversation on Zoom here, but carry on elsewhere. And I'm very, very excited. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We're thrilled to have you here and hopefully engage more. Thank you. Thanks, big thanks to our audiences for staying on and asking questions and engaging with what Nida has presented and with her work. So thank you. The next talk of under the series Researchers Practice 1.4 is happening on 27th of November, and it's with Saira Ansari. So that's going to be another amazing session. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Thank you, Nida.
Thank you, Akanksha.
Bye.
Bye.